We have, as part of our lecture series, we have people like you saw the last two times who come from out of town to tell us about their work and their approach. And we intersperse that with our own faculty and local people who are of the same reputation and the same skills and the same international knowledge as some of our guest speakers. But because they're here, because they're local, it's a whole different way of looking at people. And that's just human nature. Today, we're very fortunate to have Frank Wolden with us. Frank has been an instructor here at the school, teaching studio, teaching various urban courses for many, many years. He's a principal at Skyport Studio AVRP. For those of you who are students, you may want to get to know that because he hires lots of graduates to work at the, many of them who are here, the graduates to work at the firm. But Frank has, as I said, a national and international reputation, working on looking at how cities are formed. How does architecture or design play a role? The title of this is, well, it's on the screen, From Shiny Objects to a Source of Human Experience. But the subtitle, I think, is even more important. Can architecture and can design and the design of cities really save the planet? Everybody who is here, as a student at least, is here because they came here to save the world. That's what architecture is about. And I see some hands going up in the back, which there's an A student back there. That's, but I think it's important to think about things beyond just designing an object. And Frank is here to talk a little bit about that tonight. Frank has worked all over the world. He's worked locally. He's working on some projects that he'll tell us about that are changing the face of our neighborhood. And he will talk about some of the international things, but more importantly about his approach. Frank, I think, is the poster child for the school's motto, human-centered by design. And with that, I'll turn it over to Frank and let him talk about, can we save the planet?
Thank you. That's you and I, okay. Thank you, Mike. What do we got going? So I think I may have made an error in the way I titled this presentation tonight, because a good friend of mine told me last weekend that she was going to come to this lecture tonight because she wanted to find out how I was going to save the world. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to live up to that expectation. But one thing I do believe, and the reason I kind of approached it this way, is that cities are going to be at the center of a healthy planet as we move forward into the century. And the debate about how cities are designed is going to advance substantially. It has already, as it relates to this subject of how we create a healthy planet. So cities are made of architecture. So when we talk about cities, we have to talk about what architecture is going to do to, you know, together with policy and urban planning and all the other things. But I actually really believe architecture should lead the way in this process of how we do this. So the first slide here talks about shiny objects to an architecture, and can architecture actually in the design of cities save the planet? The shiny objects thing is kind of the central theme of where we've been. And when I have a friend who works all over the world, and I've worked with him on a number of projects in different countries, and particularly in places like China and the Middle East. We always have this discussion. He brings up this concept of you know, well, are they really going to want great design, or they just want shiny objects? You know, and you guys, if you've followed a lot of foreign projects, you know, there's a lot of, how many different ways can you kind of torture a glass tower to create something, you know, that looks great? And we all want to do that, but I think we all want to do stuff that addresses the statement on the bottom line here too. And I think this is going to be more of the key as we move into, you know, the further into this century, is how we can do that. Because I don't think any of us don't want to do beautiful creative designs, but how can we do that in a way that really creates to the quality of human experience. So I'm going to step back a little bit here and talk a little bit about maybe where we came from in the past 50 years or so. And as a student of the 70s, we talked a lot about this concept of utopian dreams and the city of the future, and how architects were going to solve that problem, how they were going to be the leaders and how to create this kind of utopian world. And you know, it started back with Corbu and any number of examples of that, many different, you know, utopian schemes that were architect design solutions that were going to address this problem. Solarian as arcologies. Lastly, and there's many of those. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have studied them, but kind of ending here for the discussion on Brasilia, which of course was a famous city that was designed in the 50s, where Oscar Niemeyer and his beautiful shiny objects was going to, going to create a great city, and you know, really went through a tremendous amount of controversy because there were beautiful architectural elements, but not a sense of place, a sense of experience, the sense of what makes people, inspires people and makes them want to live in a city. So, you know, part of this concept of what I call dystopian fears and the failure of the city is something that we've lived with for a long time. It really started with, you know, a lot of the stuff that was coming out in the early part of the 20th century that was beginning to question whether the different ways that mankind was going was really going to survive, and what the impacts of all the change was and that sort of thing. And then really the city part of it really picked up, you know, in the movies. And if you think about most of the movies we love, particularly in science fiction and stuff like that, a lot of them are about this kind of dystopian view of a city, from you know, movies like, you know, the original Blade Runner and the recent one, to Escape from New York, to The Fifth Element, to, you know, any number of cities. And if you sit down, you can, we don't realize this, but we've really created the city as the poster child in our minds for the failure of humankind in a lot of ways. So this is what I want to try to reverse as we talk tonight, is the way we've looked at cities. While all this was happening, this concept of shiny objects was really dominating cities. And we had, you know, you look at the picture on the left here, and I think the picture on the right is from San Diego, but this could be any American city where, you know, modernism was kind of taken from its original intentions and became something that dominated skylines and, you know, maybe created beautiful, pristine images, but nobody knew what was in them, you know, really how they worked, and even more importantly, how they came down to the ground and connected with the city. So the next part of this thing that I wanted to talk about is this, what I call the fix, which is where, you know, all of this was happening, and the city, everybody had left, you know, part of this was everybody had left the city with this gigantic suburban expansion and kind of abandoned the city. And so all over the country, in the late 60s, early 70s and on, we begin to look at how we're going to redevelop our downtowns and our urban areas. And in San Diego, this is an image probably in the mid 70s of what the city looked like, and everybody had left. There's a small core in the middle, you know, that was basically government and a few offices, and the rest of it was really non-existent anymore. It was just low-scale warehouses and things, and this was the image of the center city. I showed Solari's slide earlier. For those of you that know Paulo Solari, he was a visionary architect that had all these wild schemes for how cities of the future, he called arcologies, were going to be built. But I had actually gone to work with him because I got fascinated with this idea of cities way back when I was in graduate school. And one thing that struck me a lot was this diagram on the left, and he had several of these, where his idea of the arcology, this is a diagram that says, what if you took all the unused space and all the bad space and all the air and everything out of a city like London, and you put it in one of his efficient arcologies, which probably wouldn't have been a great idea, but it made a great diagram, right? So now you have a high density city that that now has the ability to let, square miles of land around it remain in a natural condition and create, all kinds of access to nature. And it was the antithesis of suburban sprawl, which was eating up the landscape at that time. So I was very struck by that and thought, I wanted, that was my first revelation about, the environment and such was, well, we really need to do what Solari says. We need to really compact cities, stop suburban expansion, and grow them in. Well, about the same time, I met a guy that's sitting right over here when I came back from working with Solari, that Mike Stebner, who was working for the city, and somehow I got a chance to talk to him, and a chance to work with him, and I found out that the city was doing something called the Center City Plan, which was exactly, in a real world analogy, kind of the same philosophy that Solari was talking about. And so the diagram on the right was really about how are we going to take this empty downtown that everybody had left, and for all the suburban expansion, it was environmentally destructive and it was fiscally expensive, and there were all kinds of, and there were a lot of social consequences that were evolving from it. And how can we redirect the city back down through policy in this case, not through design, but can we redirect it back downtown and densify the core? And I decided at that point that that was going to be the focus of my work. I was going to work in cities, and that was primarily what I was interested in, and that was going to be the core of a philosophy that we have to treat this planet properly and grow properly. So I was lucky enough then to actually get a job with Center City Development Corporation, which was started up at that time to redevelop downtown. And this is around 1980, and that's what it looked like. And other than again, that office core, this was like, almost an open kind of canvas for architecture and redevelopment. And our job was to try to figure out how to catalyze that and get it going and bring developers and architects and people to the town to do great things and infill the city. And in the middle of this was a place called Horton Plaza, which I ultimately ended up as part of the design team for. It's very tired and old right now. We've got our students looking at how to fix it. But at the time, this was an extremely innovative place, but it was an urban experience in a box. It wasn't something that worked outward to the city. We struggled very hard to make it do that, but the timing wasn't right, and the idea of a project was the way you would approach it. It's a big project that's going to cover 6.5 blocks. And in the meantime, that whole kind of shiny object thing was happening everywhere downtown. And we had buildings that were whole block ideas. We have small blocks in San Diego, so it was easy for that to happen. But this is one example of a block that was one idea on the entire block. It was a glass tower, and it was wrapped with glass, and the glass came, as you can see here, right down to the ground and completed one idea in the entire block. And so this was another thing that I was kind of struggling with, is how do you deal with that? Not only the environment that's created on the ground, but the idea that there's not more diversity, that the city's it isn't creating different experiences as you walk through the city. Well, as I moved into the Gaslamp Quarter, and because I had the opportunity to work on a master plan for the Gaslamp and ultimately do projects in Gaslamp, we saw these block patterns, and we realized that there you can't do whole block developments, right? Because this is a place that's made up of historic buildings and spaces in between them, and the block patterns are they're multiple buildings that make up a block, multiple parcels. And this is something that created the opportunity to create a scale that you could break down and create something that created diversity as you walked along the street, because it was multiple buildings and expressions. And it actually broke that scale of the city down and made it feel more human. And so this is one of my original sketches as a result of that, for one of the buildings that I was commissioned to do in Gaslamp. And this is the Fifth Avenue. It's now called the Gaslamp Hilton, I think. At the time we called it Bridgeworks. And so, this was broken down into 2 main buildings. And then even within that, the building was broke down into multiple expressions to try to relate to the concept of the Gaslamp Quarter and form essentially the western half of the gateway to the Gaslamp. And through thinking across property lines and watching the site across the street and believing that that buildings and spaces had to talk to each other, we stayed on top of the building across the street, the parcel across the street. And so a couple of years later, well, that was under construction. We got the commission to do, at this time I was the design partner for Carrier Johnson, which is a very big San Diego firm. And we were able to get the commission to design the Hard Rock Hotel. And again, this early diagram was saying it's not going to be one big idea. It's going to break down into multiple things. 2 historic buildings, and they would happen to be brick boxes, and two new buildings that would form the street face. And then essentially the tower component of it would be actually even 2 towers. And there was a scale and character that we tried to approach there. And you can actually see in the project itself a little bit of a collage of those things, from those 2 brick buildings to, you know, some of the glass towers to the tower above, and actually a building beyond. And so we were trying to create this kind of collage effect in the city of creating different buildings, different characters, and break down that idea of just one big shiny object filling a block. And so that became essentially the gateway to the gas lamp. And I think the scale and the character and the focus on the retail on the ground floor made this fit in and form a gateway to the gas lamp. And at the same time, though, you can see there over to the right, there was a new proposition forming, which was the ballpark. And one of the things we discovered when we got involved in the ballpark was that same pattern of historic buildings, essentially brick boxes, actually continued all the way through the ballpark area, and that was going to be something that was going to actually have to break down that concept as well. And of course, the ballpark's famous for saving the Western Metals building as part of the ballpark. And then when we were commissioned to develop the plan for the park at the park, which is the outfield to the ballpark, you know, the concept that we came up with was, how do you integrate essentially 5 brick boxes, historic buildings, into 2 new complexes, and again, create this kind of multiple image building here that was more about, not about a big project, but about how the multiple smaller projects sort of made up a big image. So we did this collage that some of you may have seen, which was really to talk about, like, what are the influences on that, from the ballpark to, you know, the ephemeral sky in San Diego, to the, you know, the brick history and warehousing history of the East Village. And so we started with this idea of, let's think about what makes up the buildings that go out here. And in fact, the office building collage was about scoreboards and brick buildings and the concept of bleachers and box seats and rooftop terraces and even a pre-dock tower in the middle of it. And so we did this, and ultimately the building we designed there was very much inspired by that, by an old brick box, a new brick box, the series of terraces that looked like bleachers and glass panels that were stolen from scoreboards. And so the whole idea of this building ended up being something that could come to life in the terraces and had intricacies and things associated with it that could show that life, particularly if you're on game day and you're in the ballpark and you're looking out there. But it also could actually form as one of these shiny objects that corporate America would appreciate in terms of their portfolio. So, so that's a little bit of history of how we got to where we're at right now. And I'm going to talk to you about a few things that we're currently working on that are struggling with this whole idea, again, of how do you take architecture and how do you move it into something that really is essentially creative, but at the same time is public and serves human experience. So in around 2015, I merged my studio with AVRP and we became AVRP Skyport. And I started working on this concept of a studio that really focuses on the art of city design. And what I mean by that is a little bit more than just, it really is how can design combine, good city planning, good landscape architecture, and architecture and public space in actually a design process. And so this is what we try to do. One of the first projects I want to talk about is a gigantic project that we're involved in, which is in the early stages. And David McCullough's office, he's here tonight. He's worked with us on this as well as Seaport, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I call this turning urban visions inside out, because the interesting thing is we've sold what we've done around the world so well that we have people that are making the same mistakes that we made. So at Purple Bay, this is on the corner of the Hankou River here, which is 20 kilometers south of Shanghai. And there's a huge education complex, 3 gigantic universities, a big research and development area. And we were asked to look at this concept for Purple Bay, which is right there on the corner, a very prominent site on the river in Shanghai, and to come up with a master plan vision for that would begin to kind of bring the people in the community to this area. And then there's another component about it down here, what's called InnoTown, which is going to be the second phase of that we're getting ready to start work on. But the concept that we inherited there was this idea of it called it Asian Oriental Venice, because they wanted to create all these canals off the river and create all these canal houses and build an artificial lake and essentially orient all the amenities for this community of 30,000 people around the lake. And we looked at it and thought, well, you're really talking about creating a high-rise suburb, essentially a high-rise gated community that doesn't really have a public realm. And we thought in a place like this, a gigantic development and tied with the university and this position on the river, a connection to the public realm, to the larger Shanghai region was really important. So we took all these components and we said, okay, you're going to build all these amenities around this lake you're creating, but let's figure out how to open them up and at the same time, like reverse the vision from the inside to the outside and still build the beautiful amenities around the lake, but connect to the space around you. And so the little circle that you see here in the blue, the blue dashed line there is really a concept that's emerging that would be the center of something that would connect it to the public lands that exist on the external ends of Purple Bay. And so you can see the 2 arrows there represented, particularly the one to the north. There's this 20-kilometer park that they're building and promenade that the city of Shanghai is building all the way to the Bund in the core of Shanghai. And so we looked at how can we externalize what we're doing. And again, there's all kinds of things that came out as a part of that program. And one of them was this idea of creating this, where the blue line is there, this thing called Fire Cove. And so Fire Cove would create a second, you have the lake in the middle, and now you have the cove, which goes onto the river, that would create a series of amenities that were connected to the outside world and connected the residents to this area and the park and to museums and aquariums and all kinds of gardens, and also created a face to the hotel that faced the outside world, created public space, took a shopping district and moved it away from an internal mall and externalized it to create an experience around this cove here that was a public experience that was a natural kind of evolution from their kind of gated interior lake to the outside. And with that, reconceptualized things like the shopping street they had, which was really just like Horton Plaza. It was a mall experience in a box, and saying we really need to create all these amazing terraces that look out into the river and create essentially 2-level walking streets and connect the community into them and have garden walks and things like this, so that we're now beginning to connect to the public aspects of the park. And then when you see, you look from the lake across and you see the private side of the hotel and the public side of the hotel that connects to the idea of aquariums and and other types of public uses and sculpture gardens and things like that would be part of this expanded experience. And so where this is at right now, surprisingly, the Chinese government got all of this information and came back and told them, well, this is what we're looking for, And so apparently next phases of this are going to evolve around this concept of connecting their internal lake to the outside world. And moving away from this concept, moving towards the public realm, away from the concept of having this kind of internal gated community. This is a project we've just begun to work on. So it's in very early stages. It's Simmons Valley. It's in really in the open plains of Canada and Calgary. And in this one, because for some reasons associated with this project, because there's nothing there to start with, we basically looked at architecture first and thought about how architecture and symbolism could be the starting point to create a place that had an identity here. So some of the original graphics, started to come up with this idea of how do you reflect the mountains and then the agrarian nature of some of these things and the history of kind of the agrarian buildings that were built in the plains and that sort of thing. And so the early images and then other kinds of precedent images that would sort of lead us to how buildings can start to form that idea. And we brought this to, and this, like I said, this is something we're working on right now, so we're in the middle of it. But we brought this to what we call our idea lab, our ideation lab, where we kind of explore how these designs are going to evolve and what the ideas that drive them. And this was a place where we started with models, and we thought, well, because we're talking about these forms and ideas and architectural concepts that are going to drive this project, we need to start looking at how those models and those forms can start to form this image that we were looking for. And an early rendering of that then shows buildings that are starting to be sculpted and formed in more architectural ways that would relate to that imagery. Now, in the meantime, there are components of this project. It originally was designed as a standard business park, and with a big parking lot and a number of office buildings. And so our client also wanted to create more than that. So we have these cultural nodes, we have retail, we have neighborhood, community servicing things. And in the middle of this, there's a replacement of the one thing that was on this site, which was this ranch market that would be kind of the heart of this whole thing. So out of that, these different kind of clusters formed. And we begin to, as you can see up in the upper left rather, try to figure out how we're going to create these kinds of plazas and kind of, I'd say, kind of European style walkways and things that are going to be the glue that are going to connect all these different neighborhoods together. So there's different levels of things, from internal courtyards to the public space around each cluster to the space in between, and then how does that relate to the market space that's evolving in the middle. And so right now, what we're doing, going into the next step, is trying to figure out how to take what is a strong kind of architectural concept because we think that for the sake of well-designed pedestrian-oriented communities, you don't have to give up, really, exotic architectural ideas and such. And so this is something right now where this is a project that's trying to combine this idea of pretty, I guess, exuberant architectural thought with the idea of creating community and connecting things. All right, so I guess kind of the main course tonight is probably Seaport San Diego, which is something we've been working on for quite a while. And we were selected to be the design architect, vision architect for this, and we're leading a team that involves a number of different players. David and his firm is again involved in a lot of the landscape architecture concepts. And we have Perkins and Eastman and Von Davies, who's an expert in public realm. And Gensler is working on components of it. So it's a multifaceted project with a large design team that we're moving forward with to come up with concepts for how this area is going to work. It's a bit of a long-term project. It's got a long entitlement process. So that's the downside. That's going to take a while to get it going. But the upside is that it's giving us time to really think about how to put together a project that's going to make sense for the city and be more than a project. Because I've always said this is a piece of our city. It's not just another project. So it starts with this whole concept of the Emerald Necklace, which the Port Master Plan has evolved as this kind of conceptual green space that connects the inside of the San Diego Bay all the way from Harbor Island and Point Loma all the way to Chula Vista National City and beyond. And the vision of a pedestrian-oriented, accessible waterfront. And this area, when the RFP came out, was called the 100% corner, and which really makes it kind of the jewel of this Emerald Necklace. And it's I think in most people's opinion, maybe the most important, could potentially the most important place on the waterfront. So it was a bit of an honor to get a chance to do this. The concept of what was there was kind of striking. Now, everybody was endeared to Seaport Village. Most of us have gone there for most of our lives, from a lot of people from when they were little kids on, and it's a very nice, enjoyable environment. But when we looked at everything from the G Street Mall to the north, all the way south around the headquarters building to the Hyatt, really what's there is an inordinate amount of surface parking areas. And what you see in the orange is mostly one-story small buildings on this key piece of property here. And the blue building essentially is a building there, but it's in somewhat disrepair and underutilized. And so the idea here of what do we want on our waterfront was, well, we love the quaint character of Seaport, and we love to go to the fish market, and Ruaco Park is there. But a major city at this particular point in time in our evolution needs, a more dramatic, a more powerful, more economically viable waterfront. And so that was the idea. Can we do that and maintain some of the qualities of what are there and actually add to it substantially, both from a local perspective, from a visitor perspective, from an economic development perspective. So the first challenge here came from something that's a long-standing problem in San Diego that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, thought about, and may have opinions about, which is how big destination resort hotels and the convention center, essentially with Harbor Drive and the railroad tracks, cut off the waterfront from the city. And so this is a pretty striking example of that. And because of the way things evolved, basically the backside of these buildings faced the city, and the city died, and there's really very little way to connect to the waterfront. And this has been a very controversial thing for many years now. So it kind of looks like that, right? There's just no way, to get from the city to the water. So, and when you look at Seaport Village, it's actually part of the problem as it exists today, even in its underdeveloped, underutilized fashion. It doesn't have any real connections to the water. It's a big parking lot with landscaping. And if you look on Pacific Highway corridor there, that's what you see. There's no sense, you can't see the bay. There's no sense of it beyond. There's no connection to the water. And actually the Kettner corridor is the same. So when we looked at view corridors and what's happening today, you can see that all of that's starting to change. And there is a new path through the hotel. The Broadway complex is going to continue streets through. But Seaport Village in this 100% corner is the place where there's the greatest opportunity to connect the city to the bay. So this was the basic concept that drove our initial submittal and our winning proposal for this. Now, having said that, those are not just streets, right? We want to have an interesting environment that we're going to create, and as the city moves down, we want it to become an interesting thing. So we looked at those as character connections, and the idea that they're all different. If you look at the North Esplanade and this kind of bayfront park thing where Ruaco is, which is underutilized right now, and a lot of people feel not as successful as it could be, and Tuna Harbor, where the fishermen are, which we've been working with very extensively, you see an opportunity to create a new esplanade that has a new mission and a new image that connects from the north down to Seaport. The second main player is Pacific Highway, and we call it the California Curve because when we started looking at it, we thought, you know what? Starting at the foot of Pacific Highway, it's really the beginning of California. And so our idea was that we're going to create a street. It's going to be pedestrian oriented. It's going to reflect the essence of California. So the idea became how to create this California curve that comes down and connects and becomes a pier at the end. And then that connection being the first city connection, the second one being the Market Kettner connection, which today doesn't really even hardly exist. But if you look at it from the Hyatt Park to, the Marina Park, if that was developed as a walkable street, that was a green street that felt like a park all the way from the trolley stop through the project to the water. And then two other big components of that are the existing pier and bringing the pier back, through the project, and introducing something we call the hood, which I'll talk about in a second, which is kind of the village center, and would kind of, in a very different way, have some of the experiences that Seaport Village would have. It would be a very high density area, but we used an analogy here in all of these areas to some great European spaces, the plaza on the 100% corner being the Campo, and then we thought about the big walking street on Pacific Highway being like Los Ramblas, and then the Barrio Gattaca, adjacent to Los Ramblas, if you've been there, is this, and you can see some images from it here, is this beautiful little, tiny scale streets that are about exploration and discovery and, human scale. And we wouldn't be able to create the same little tiny streets, or we wouldn't also want to replicate the historical architecture. But the scale and character, the concept of exploration and shops and things around the corner and that kind of stuff, the Barrio Gattaca sort of created this concept of the hood. Now to get a little bit into the design here, and what you're going to see today, these are kind of architectural and design diagrams of what's in process. It's not there. These buildings are the beginnings of ideas, and the locations and things are the beginnings of where things are going to happen. But it'll give you a feel of where the project is going. One of the big things is that there's a water plant, and you can see there's lots of boats from the working fishermen's in Tuna Harbor to dock and dine boats to recreational boats to all kinds of events that will happen in the water, and not only boats, but also floating swimming pools and barges and things like that, because this is not a project that's just about the land. It's a project that's about the water as well, and it really starts with the water. So there's an exuberant water plan that starts here, and this is something that our collaborator from Perkins and Eastman, Von Davies, is an expert in this, and he's done these kinds of projects all over the world, including South Africa, waterfront that's world renowned. So that's one thing. And then the second part of it is the development of the public realm on land. And this is important because here we didn't start with the buildings. We started with the idea of creating this exuberant public realm. How to design the spaces, the experiences, the parks, the plazas, and how to pedestrianize the streets, even where there's vehicles on them, that we would make them pedestrian first, to create an environment where the public space kind of determined the framework for the design of the buildings. So with that in mind, then the public realm was developed, and then there's a series of buildings that are being designed. And again, these are design diagrams for buildings that are being developed right now. And the reason they're not just white boxes is because they're actually going to be designs, and the design of the buildings has to relate to the design of the public spaces that we're creating. So if you start from, from the north along Pacific Highway, where Rocco Park is, which David's, company has been working on recrafting ideas here as it relates to the creation of the aquarium. So the aquarium now is a multi-level aquarium, which actually starts with Rocco Park, and it's under the park, and it terraces up and forms an experience in this corner of the project. And it addresses both the Pacific Highway and the Esplanade corridors on either side of it coming in. The second piece of this is a very unique component that you don't normally see in a project like this, which is a 7-story school. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it has a direct relationship to the mission of the aquarium as well. And this is where we start talking about, how projects become more than just another retail mixed-use project, and how architecture starts getting involved and how we're going to save the planet, right? So then as you go further into the project, the tower, the observation tower, was called the spire, which normally sits in a big open by itself here. If you go to the Seattle Space Needle or many of the other places. In this case, it's integrated into a marketplace. And so it grows out of a marketplace adjacent to the aquarium and the school and sets up a relationship of what happens in the sky to what happens on the ground and even into the depths of the ocean. And this is something that we intend to try to create a realistic relationship between these things so you can understand and even tie it into San Diego's history as a place on the bay, in the water, on the bluffs, in the sky. And the next piece of this then is an office building that's being designed by the Gensler Group that would sit at the gateway here. And this office building would focus, together with additional office in the marketplace, on the blue tech industry, which is again part of the mission of the bay and the project. And it's not just office space. It's actually there for a purpose, to connect with the school and the university and the aquarium and such, focusing on marine ecology. And then in addition to this, one of the things we have to do is the hotels on the waterfront are very expensive. So we have to design a project that creates that kind of market rate, high-end hotel, but we also have to provide hotels that are affordable. So we have concepts for a high-end hostel, which would be located in this particular area. And again, these are the beginnings of the architectural concepts that we're developing that are going to be both, I think, exciting architecture and create exciting urban spaces. And then in the middle of this, and the whole idea of which is now a 5-star, high-end hotel, is to create a hotel experience that really is the energy in the middle of the village. And so we put it in the middle of the village, not on the periphery and in the ends or out on the water, but we wanted it to energize the center of the project and be an urban hotel. External, not just a outside, destination resort, but something that was really, lived in and out between all the urban spaces and the people and that sort of thing. So as that urban hotel, we put it there. And then the final piece of the puzzle at this point then is the concept of a micro hotel, which is again is an affordable concept. It's a very nice hotel, but it's affordable by the nature of the fact that the rooms are very, very small. And this is a new phenomenon that is happening around the globe. So that rounds out the idea of a public realm and a collection of buildings that are infilling that public realm. Now, the other part of this is how does this create unique experiences? So what I referred to as the hood before, it's a little hard to understand here, but this is a series of these small streets that are, crisscross across the site in different areas and create different scales of experience. And they're all lined with retail shops and market stalls. And this is like I said, in a way, it's a very, very high density urban version of what the experience of Seaport Village is right now, which is walking around and exploring and finding small shops and, in an experience that will draw people from the hotels and the water and the city. We see this as a very local place. And the feeling is if you're going to attract tourists these days, which of course the city wants to, the best way to do that is to create localized places because that's where tourists want to be. And that's the best thing for the city. So we want to create a local place that brings all of us down there. I don't know how many of you go to Seaport Village today, but usually when people come from out of town, right? So we want this to be a downtown event and feel like a local place and combine. And then again, we found this image. These projects are just under design, so we don't have renderings of them yet. But we found this image from this project in Sweden, which was kind of the sense of how do you do a contemporary Gothica, and maybe it feels like this. And it's got really high quality materials, but it's these kinds of small spaces and things that you find in that kind of European experience I was talking about. And then the next experience is something which is really this Pacific Crescent. It's the end of Pacific Highway on the bay, and it's a crescent cove. And this is kind of the living room of the city. And this is where the main hotel is, and it floats above a series of terraces that step down to a plaza and a fountain, and create, essentially what we think is the living room for downtown on the waterfront. And when you look at that, you have We have, you know, beer gardens on one side and a marketplace, and then and with the hotel, a series of terraces that start on the ground, come down and touch the bay, and, you know, have a kind of a loose public experience. And as those terraces move up, they create, and, you know, these open public terraces on the second level, you know, that have both restaurants and just, you know, entertainment decks and bar service and things like that. So it's a level up from the ground level city experience, and then even in some cases up to a third level, and then up to higher spaces in the hotel. And so then when you look at this, you know, across, you know, from Pacific Highway coming down and around, and you look at how that comes out to the pier, you can get a sense of this as this place that has a human scale, and creates a highly energized place on the waterfront, you know, that really becomes the center of the city, this living room for the city. Then, in addition to that, the recasting of the Marina Park into something that would be very San Diego, and as the park that we're talking about coming through from Kettner kind of opens up into Marina Park, there's a series of uses in terms of retail along a pier, a beach that would actually, an artificial beach that would be created on the bay, a series of park spaces, and a theme of outdoors and health and San Diego lifestyle in this rethought park space on the water. So the last thing I want to talk about, and it gets into this concept of urban optimism, and, you know, why I started with this idea of like our dystopian view of the city, and which we haven't completely forgotten yet, and to think of a transformation to, you know, a view of cities that drives, you know, a healthy future. One of the things that happened in working with Scripps, Harry Helling, who's the director of the Scripps Aquarium, is working with us along with a private developer. And he and his team from UCSD and Scripps came up with this idea that we were going to theme the aquarium with this concept of ocean optimism, which is a new movement that's actually originating in UCSD, and looking at not, you know, everything that's going wrong with the oceans, but where the hope spots are and all that kind of stuff. Now, that term is proprietary, so we can't actually use ocean optimism, but the idea is that the spirit of that is going to drive the concept for the aquarium. And as I thought about this whole idea of architecture's role in designing cities in the future, it occurred to me that I need to look at it as urban optimism, as an expanded view of what cities can do and what they can, you know, what architecture can do in cities and what that can do, you know, for a positive future. So that's where I started thinking about this concept of urban optimism. And it grew out of purpose. Obviously, this is a purpose for this place and its combination with the school. So these are just some photographs. This is doesn't show too much yet, but this is the beginning of the walls of the aquarium coming down Pacific Highway. And that's, and then on the other side, which you see here, where Roaco Park is kind of rethought. And we put this picture of the bluffs in San Diego because this particular side of the aquarium, and you'll see as I go through this, was really thought of as bringing in this inspiration of San Diego bluffs, and even the story of that in some of the interpretive venues and such that would occur along here. So as you look at the aquarium growing up from the new version of Roaco Park, you can see it becomes a vertical park that's kind of now ascending above the levels of the aquarium and creating a series of terraces that are inspired by this whole idea of San Diego bluffs. And what this does is it brings you to the top and loads the aquarium from the very top, and again, through the experience down into the aquarium, you have the sense of descent into the ocean, and on the other side, the view of the tower, which is the ascent to the sky. And so this is looking the circular thing, which is this kind of reverse Guggenheim that's on the right there, is between the school and the aquarium, and it's that kind of central space. It's a themed entertainment version of an exit stair that takes you down from the roof and creates an experience and brings you down from and connects to the school and creates this interstitial space that has to do with the relationship between the aquarium and the school, which is going to focus on marine. It's going to be it's actually not a school for legal purposes. It's a learning center. So the idea is that it's going to be a marine ecology learning center where people from all over the world go there, and professors and students that are both grade school through junior college. And it's actually being put together in a combination of joint venture with city schools, UCSD and Scripps Institute, and community college. So it's going to be a very unique thing. And this oculus, as we call it, is something that's actually the connective tissue between the aquarium and the school. And so Harry and I talked one day about this and about what can this school do with its mission and its purpose here. And we talked quite a bit about how it related to the idea of an aquarium, but we then started talking about how does it relate to the rest of the project. And the whole idea, again, of this being something that is more than just another project. We started thinking, well, maybe it's the brain, and maybe it has a story to tell. And that story that has purpose, that has to do with that has to do with ocean ecology and beyond, could actually have tentacles that could reach out and have an influence on everything from, the entry gateways and the California experience, and again with interpretive experiential venues, not just a concept, but real things that could involve students and people who are using these things. The idea that it could have an influence on the hood and the whole urban neighborhood that's being created, and then something we called the crack, which was because this Pacific Highway here actually is an earthquake fault. So the idea there was, what if that earthquake fault actually did have this California crack that was a fountain that grew up towards the brain, and there was interpretive venues and discussions that students and locals and tourists could experience that was part of that mission. And then the pier very much, because the pier is where, the fish market and the market and, the working waterfront idea is going to be. And that ties directly into the mission of the school and marine ecology. So, and then the concept of, as I talked about before, even the coastal bluffs and the whole side of the aquarium, again, having things that are related to San Diego's coast in terms of interpretive exhibits and things like that. So we're working on this whole concept of the school being something that has tentacles that flow through and change and transform what would normally be just kind of a retail experience and things like that. So in closing, I want to talk about something called the quadruple bottom line. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard this concept of the triple bottom line, but the partners in this project were asked what is their top priority in this project, and it's a legacy project. Obviously, it has to make money. No one's going to do it if it doesn't make money. But they said that the triple bottom line was the most important thing. And the triple bottom line, for those of you that don't know what it is, I don't know very much about it, but I know it's an accounting system that actually measures more than just profit when it measures the success of a project. It measures profit. It's the 3 Ps, right? Profit, people, what it does for people, and what it does for the planet. And so the definition of success is broadened, right? And then in this case, we added the 4th component, the 4th P, which is purpose. And as you can see, we're kind of looking at how can architecture, land use, all the components of what we're doing here bring purpose to this place. And again, not be just another collection of buildings and retail stores and hotel rooms. So in closing, I guess my conclusion from this whole discussion is that I'm going to figure out what this urban optimism means. I'm going to figure out how do we talk about architecture's role beyond shiny objects. I think for the architectural students and even the rest of the architects and appreciators of architecture in the audience, to me, the concept of how we design cities needs to bring the same rigor and the same creative energy that we've put for many years into these shiny objects and the buildings, the one-offs and such we create, to projects and designs that actually have a much greater impact, that actually, really move cities from just shiny objects into places of human experience. And so my closing thoughts here are, cities are our future. You've probably heard that said a lot around here. I know Mike said it a lot. Believe in them, embrace them, and design them well. Thank you. Take some questions? Okay, yeah.
So I saw a lot of what you were talking about with trying to take the dense, walkable pedestrian environments from Europe and try to carry a lot of them over here, right? And then you had mentioned how a lot of what Seaport Village has now is parking lots, right? And I suspect some of that probably has to do with the parking minimum. And looking at all the amount of businesses you want to put inside here, how are you going to get the government to relax these parking minimums to, from a policy standpoint, support maybe like having this actual type of density, right? I mean, if people can't park here, how are they going to bring the transit stations alive? How are you going to funnel all these people into this area without parking lots?
So this is kind of a two-part answer to that question. One is that underneath all of this is 2,300 parking spaces on 2 levels of extremely expensive parking. And this is what's, and that is to start with, that is a parking strategy that reduces what would have been 5,000 parking spaces to 2,300 parking spaces, because of the way we're able to look at these things today and the way we're able to look at managed parking solutions and transit and mobility conditions and things like that. So, but that's probably the biggest challenge for this project. Now, in addition to what's happening to that is there's a discussion about in 5 years, 7 years, when all this opens, are we even going to need that parking? And this is a very difficult thing because you can't convince anybody to eliminate it in the approval stages, right? Or in the marketing stages, because retailers and, aquarium goers and such aren't going to accept not having any parking. So we have to provide that parking. You're going to find from the policy viewpoint that people aren't, so they're going to say, yeah, that's great, but we have a parking problem right now. How are you going to do that? So it's a real challenge. So, what we're trying to do is look at contingency ways of looking at parking here that say, what if we develop this in such a way that by the time it opens, if only 30% of the parking that's required today, because this is what everybody's talking about now, and not just planners and dreamers, but actually developers are saying this, like, we don't want to build all this parking because with driverless cars and Uber and Lyft and the whole changing way that people are, the predictions are that we're not going to need it. So, and we're also looking at the other issue that where you do build it, because we're not going to be able to not build parking, is what happens when you don't need it, and what do you do in terms of reuse? Is it going to be designed in a way that it can be reused for something else? So, and the mobility plans, there's all kinds of things there, from, different shuttles that are required to, actually opening up the trolley and making it actually relate to this area. And there's even a sky tram system that's actually way along, that's being proposed by the county that would come of it that is being discussed now that would go to Seaport and to the airport. So that's a really big issue you bring up, and it's a very good thing that we're at right now, where we're actually looking at how are we going to be able to eliminate, the need for all of this parking, but it's still a problem figuring out how to get there. So, does that answer your question?
Well, like, how much does this stress you out. Like I think a lot of people try to project what they want versus what will actually happen. We can't get the city to connect the airport to its trolley system.
So I could say this, $70,000 parking spaces, which is what they cost in a parking structure like this, stresses everybody out, you know, and it's, but there's positive energy because of all the things that are changing with new mobility patterns and stuff. So, yeah, and I think you're going to see that policies are going to start shifting and things like that. So, yeah, hopefully so. You have a, yes, Hannah.
Thank you for talking.
Sure.
One of the first things you said in the beginning, at least when you got to SEAPORT, was that you designed the public realm first.
Mm-hmm.
How do you design a public realm without architecture? Do you design buildings? Do you design how people move around? Do you design the parking lot? Like, what do you do? I mean, for somebody who's studying architecture, how do you design without architecture?
So I'm not suggesting that you don't that you design it in a vacuum without the buildings. I'm just saying that the traditional way of saying, like, we're going to look at it, because very often what happens is you're given an architectural job, even one that has multiple buildings, and you start with the buildings and the uses, and then very often the open space and the public realm is kind of the afterthought, you know. So what I'm saying is that this concept of conceptualizing the open space framework at the same time that you're conceptualizing the buildings and the uses, it becomes the framework and the buildings become infill. But I'm not suggesting that you do it independent of that. I mean, you know, in SEAPORT, at the same time that we're working on the public realm, we're also conceptualizing how the buildings are going to connect and contribute to it. And not only just connect and contribute to it, but how they're going to design-wise integrate with it and create that kind of experience we want.
So essentially, it's like reiterator how I'm seeing it. In school, we're taught to look at a building as an independent object, as a siteless object, even though our professors, like stuff you want to have us think about the site, we really don't. I mean, yeah, we might say some mumbo jumbo that says that we thought about the site and how some lines connect to other parts of town, but we don't actually see how a person experiences the building when they walk up to it, or how the building intersects with the sidewalk. So you're saying that the experience starts before you even get to the sidewalk, or that how the building actually meets.
And the relationship of vertical, horizontal, space, you know, design elements and the activities that they house is where the magic is, I believe. And it's interesting because most of us who have been involved in architecture would teach that and say that's important. But then in all the years that I've been doing this, I've come to the conclusion that most architects either don't get the opportunity to, because of the way projects are kind of approached and the way clients look at them, or just haven't really made that connection. And so much of the buildings that are being designed as buildings independent of the concept of how they're going to connect with public spaces and the kinds of experiences they're going to create. I think landscape architects see that all the time, right? But so we've gotten much better at that. Some of those kind of, you know, glass towers that came straight down to the ground, you know, 20 years ago, you don't see too much of that anymore. You see people kind of really trying to work with the idea. But I think it's a big message for architectural students in particular coming up, is to think that way, to think about creating those kinds of experiences and not just the object you're designing, for sure. Any other questions, or where are we at with things?
I want to thank Frank again. I think there's a couple more points I want to raise that Frank talked about. One is we don't think of these things as questions. Get a question. Oh.
Thank you so much for coming out. It was really good to hear your history and how you San Diego. And if you want to prevent that show perspective of looking through the plaza and out to the ocean. Previously, it seemed like there was maybe a TV screen floating on the
Yes, yes. Yes, it is. That was, you saw a rendering that was part of our original proposal, but that idea of things happening in the water and barges with TV screens, and even if you talk to UCSD and Harry and his group from the school, they will actually want to have classrooms out on barges in the ocean and things like that. So I think that's all stuff that will be part of this proposal for sure. Of course. The observation tower? Well, I could tell you a little bit about that. First of all, everything doesn't exist for the specific purpose of, like we're talking about saving the planet and all that kind of stuff, but they all have contributions. And everything is progressing, in terms of development and design into things that connect with those kinds of themes more. The tower itself actually is being designed as a kind of a multimedia experience. So it's not just where you take an elevator to the top and then you get to see, like the Space Needle, for example, you get to see the observation. There's actually, we're designing into this these gondolas that as they take you up, and they have computer screens that are just clear glass screens like you see in science fiction movies, where you can look through and see the bay, but you can also be told a story. And the story is about everything from the ascent, and how that relates to this concept of San Diego and its history in aerospace, similar to the way the aquarium is actually telling the story of San Diego and the bay and the descent into the ocean, and so there are concepts and themes like that, including, then you get to the top using technology to actually show people what was the bay like, 10,000 years ago. And you could see that and experience that, and then what was it like in 1900, and what is it like today? And so there's a whole educational component to that is part of the entertainment concept for that kind of ties into a lot of the storylines and such. So beyond the fact that it's just it's a ride and a tower that you get up in the sky and look down on things. So.
Well, thank you. I just want to let one last comment. Just again, we don't think of things as projects. You start with the public realm. And one thing that Frank and I have talked about, for architects to learn, we have to do more than just put a skin on a pro forma that some developer comes up with. You've got to think much broader, because you never get the quality that you really want. I want to give you a NewSchool gift packet. Thank you. And one of the things you may have noticed, that Frank does a lot of drawing. I don't think he has a computer in his office, unless it's dust covered. So we have the NewSchool colored pencils for you, so you can at least go back and just continue working.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you bet.